When you pick up Samuel Taylor Coleridge's Biographia Literaria, you might expect a straightforward autobiography, something like a modern memoir where a writer looks back on their life, their friendships, and their struggles. But what you actually get is something much more ambitious and much more strange. It is a hybrid work, part memoir, part literary criticism, and part deep, heavy metaphysics. It is the sound of a brilliant, restless mind trying to map out not just where he has been, but how the human mind works and how we, as humans, perceive the world around us. To understand why he wrote this, you have to understand the man. Coleridge was a giant of the Romantic era, but he was also a man of immense contradictions. He was a philosopher who struggled with addiction, a poet who often felt misunderstood, and a thinker who was constantly battling the critics of his day. By 1817, when this book was published, he wasn't just trying to tell his life story, he was trying to defend his reputation and provide a roadmap for anyone who wanted to understand the true nature of creativity and thought. The book begins with a sense of defense. Coleridge spends a significant amount of time addressing the people who had spent years tearing him down. He addresses the charge of being an irritable genius. He makes a very specific distinction here between what he calls talent and genius. To Coleridge, talent is something learned, a skill that can be practiced and perfected, often through a restless, reactionary effort to mimic what has come before. Genius, however, is something much more stable and innate. It is an internal power that directs itself toward an ideal. He wants the reader to know that his intellectual restlessness wasn't a lack of discipline, but the byproduct of a mind that was constantly reaching for something higher. He also uses the early chapters to defend his early poetry. At the time, there was a massive debate about poetic diction, basically, how a poet should use language. Some thought poetry should be elevated and artificial, while others thought it should be plain. Coleridge finds himself in the middle, defending his own choices while also defending his friend, Robert Southey. He speaks about the malicious critic as if it were a natural, destructive force, like a windmill that batters anything in its path. He portrays these critics as people who attack through guilt by association, trying to drag down great thinkers simply because they are friends with someone controversial. But as you move through the book, the focus shifts. The personal defense starts to give way to a much larger, much more profound investigation of the human psyche. Coleridge becomes obsessed with the law of association, the idea of how one thought triggers another, creating a chain of ideas in the mind. He is fighting against the materialists of his time, thinkers like David Hartley, who argued that the human mind was essentially a machine. They believed that our thoughts were just the result of physical vibrations and mechanical associations, a series of dominoes falling one after another. Coleridge finds this idea deeply offensive to the dignity of the human spirit. He argues that if the mind were just a machine, then free will and reason would be impossible. We wouldn't be creators, we would just be biological clocks ticking away. To prove that the mind is more than just a collection of physical reactions, he uses a fascinating, almost haunting example. He tells the story of a woman who, during a fever, began speaking in forgotten languages, like Latin or Greek. She had never studied these languages, yet they surfaced from her subconscious. To Coleridge, this was proof that sensory impressions are never truly lost. They stay latent, buried deep within the mind, waiting for a moment of crisis to resurface. This suggests a cosmic, imperishable chain of causality, a connection between our individual experiences and a much larger, more spiritual reality. This leads us to the heart of the book, the part that most people study in literature classes. This is where Coleridge moves from psychology into high metaphysics, and it's where he introduces his famous distinction between fancy and imagination. He describes fancy as a mechanical process. It is the mind taking existing memories and rearranging them in new ways, like a child playing with building blocks. It's clever, it's decorative, and it can be beautiful. But it doesn't actually create anything new, it just shuffles the deck. Imagination, however, is something entirely different. He divides it into two parts, primary and secondary. Primary imagination is the divine-like power of perception. It is the faculty that allows us to perceive the world as a unified whole rather than just a collection of disconnected objects. It is the bridge between the human mind and the act of creation itself. Then there is secondary imagination. This is the uniquely human faculty. It is the power that dissolves the perceptions of the world and recreates them to achieve organic unity. When a great poet writes, they aren't just rearranging words, they are taking the raw, chaotic data of life and fusing it into a new, living whole. This is why a great poem feels like a single, living organism, rather than a list of descriptions. As he settles into this deep philosophical mode, he turns his gaze toward his contemporary and friend, William Wordsworth. This is one of the most famous critiques in literary history. Coleridge actually praises Wordsworth for his revolutionary work. He admires how Wordsworth moved poetry away from the artificial, flowery language of the previous century and towards something more grounded. However, he fundamentally disagrees with Wordsworth's core theory. Wordsworth believed that poetry should use the real language of men, the simple, unadorned speech of rustic, uneducated people. Coleridge argues that this is a mistake. He believes that while the language of the common man is beautiful in its own way, it is too limited for the high abstract reflections required by great poetry. He argues that if you want to express the profound mysteries of existence, you cannot rely solely on the vocabulary of a shepherd. He critiques Wordsworth's actual writing, noting an inconstancy of style, where the poet jumps jarringly between the sublime and the mundane, failing to maintain the organic unity he claims to seek. It's a critique of a man trying to be simple, but who cannot help but be complex. At this point in the book, the reader realizes that Biographia Literaria is not just a book about poetry. It is a book about the struggle to find truth in a world that is increasingly trying to explain everything away through mechanics and materialism. As the book draws to a close, the tone shifts again. It becomes deeply personal and, in many ways, quite lonely. Coleridge moves away from the mechanics of the mind and toward the mechanics of the soul. He addresses the rumors that had followed him for years, accusations of infidelity or religious skepticism. He defends his faith, but he does so in a way that is uniquely his own. He argues that faith is not the enemy of reason, but rather its natural conclusion. He uses a beautiful, haunting metaphor to explain this. He compares the transition from reason to faith to the transition from sunset to twilight. When the sun is high, the light of reason is bright and clear, and it illuminates everything in a direct, logical way. But as the sun sets, the light fades. In that fading light, the harsh edges of the world soften, and as the logic of the day gives way to the darkness of twilight, the stars of spiritual truth finally become visible. To Coleridge, reason is the light that shows us the world, but faith is the light that shows us the universe. The book ends on a note of profound reflection. Coleridge looks back on his life and the immense cost of his intellectual journey. He expresses a desire to have kindled minds, to have sparked a fire in others that would burn long after he was gone, rather than just publishing volumes of books that might be forgotten. There is a sense of isolation in his final words. He faces the reality that his ideas are incredibly complex, perhaps even too complex, for a superficial public to grasp. He is a man who has spent his life trying to bridge the gap between the human and the divine, only to find himself standing in the twilight, watching the stars come out. If you look at the shape of the whole work, it's a journey from the external to the internal. He starts by defending his name against the external world, the critics and the social scandals. Then he moves into the internal world of the human mind, trying to understand how we think and perceive. Finally, he moves into the spiritual world, trying to understand how we connect to the infinite. It is a difficult book, and it is not a book that offers easy answers. It is a book of arguments, counter-arguments, and deep, searching questions. But in doing so, Coleridge gives us something much more valuable than a simple autobiography. He gives us a map of the human struggle to find meaning in a world that is constantly trying to reduce us to mere biological machines. He reminds us that there is a difference between merely collecting facts and truly imagining the world, and that the most important truths often reveal themselves only when the light of reason begins to fade.